A line of women stands in the cold before dawn. Rough fabric skirts, shaved heads, numbers tattooed on their left forearms. Among them, a young woman, barely 20 years old, holds her own body with her arms crossed, as though she could hide something beneath the worn cloth. She is 4 months pregnant, and up to that moment, no one in the camp knows. An SS officer walks along the rows holding a sheet of paper. He makes a brief announcement. Pregnant women will be transferred to a special section with more food, milk, and medical care. All they have to do is step forward to receive it. A murmur runs through the lines. Some women look at one another. Others make silent calculations. How many days they have gone without enough to eat. How much weight they have lost. What even a few weeks with an extra bowl of soup might mean. One hand goes up. Then another. Then another. Within minutes, nearly 200 women have taken that step forward. She does not. She would not know how to explain why. Something about the ease with which that man promises food, in a place where there is never anything to spare, keeps her still. The 200 women are led toward trucks. The trucks are not going to the kitchen. No one explained to her, at that moment, the unwritten rule that governed every corner of Auschwitz. A pregnant woman was not a woman about to bring life into the world. To the machinery running the camp, she was a problem to be solved before that life could be born. What led a place designed for mass death to invest time, personnel, and planning in hunting pregnancies no one had asked to see? And above all, what did a pregnant woman have to do inside that place to survive a question designed so that no answer could ever be the right one? The figure is not a minor detail. At Auschwitz-Birkenau, between 7 and 8 out of every 10 people stepping off a deportation train were sent directly to their deaths within the first few hours, before anyone recorded their names in any camp register. Being visibly pregnant almost invariably guaranteed ending up on the wrong side of that selection. The woman's age did not matter. Her health did not matter. Her actual ability to work did not matter. For Jewish prisoners, that rule had not a single exception throughout the entire existence of the camp. Arriving pregnant meant dying that same day, within hours of stepping off the train. For other prisoners, Polish women, Roma women, German political prisoners, the same sentence was applied without distinction until 1943. After that, something changed, but precision matters here. Change did not mean compassion, as we will see. The clock was running in 2 directions at once. On the one hand, each passing week of pregnancy made it harder to hide the body beneath forced labor, constant hunger, and the thin cloth of a prisoner's uniform. On the other, if a woman managed to conceal it until labor began, the machinery did not stop. It merely changed methods. A phenol injection directly into the heart, a gas chamber. Later, depending on the period and the block, the drowning of the newborn in a bucket of water in front of its own mother. Behind each of those methods, there was not merely a god acting out of personal cruelty. Although personal cruelty existed in abundance, there was a policy, documented and sustained from above. The regime's medical authorities did not see a pregnant Jewish woman as a life already underway, but as the concrete possibility of a future generation, and for the racial ideology of the Third Reich, that possibility itself was considered a threat that had to be eliminated before birth. Surviving pregnancy in Auschwitz, then, was not a medical matter. It meant surviving a political calculation written directly onto the body. Everything began on the ramp. The trains arrived at night or before dawn, after days of travel without water or food, with people still dazed by confinement and hunger. There, in a matter of seconds per person, an SS doctor decided with a simple motion of the hand who went right and who went left. There were no questions, no files, no time. One movement of a finger was enough to separate life from immediate death. Among the doctors who performed that function, none became as closely associated with the Auschwitz ramp as Josef Mengele, who personally conducted many of the selections during 1944, the year in which most of the documented cases in this video are concentrated. Survivors who worked near the ramp later remembered how mechanical the procedure was. Selecting a single train could take hours, with thousands of people still waiting their turn while the process continued only a few meters ahead. There was no need to shout or improvise. It was enough to repeat the same gesture again and again, throughout the entire day. What is extraordinary is that much of what we know today about those scenes does not come only from later testimony, but from photographs taken by camp personnel themselves. A group of SS officers formally assigned to document the operation of Auschwitz for internal administrative purposes systematically photographed the arrival of trains, the selection lines, and the precise moment families were separated. Those images, known today as the Auschwitz album, survived the war by sheer chance and now allow us to reconstruct, with an unusual degree of precision for this kind of history, exactly what the scene we have just described looked like. The camp that tried to erase all evidence of its own crimes during the final months of the war, blowing up crematoria, burning entire archives, unintentionally left behind much of the evidence that now sustains its own historical condemnation. Children, the elderly, the sick, and anyone visibly weak were immediately rejected for forced labor. Pregnant women automatically fell into that same category, regardless of age or physical strength. But reducing that decision to a simple calculation of labor productivity means failing to understand the full logic behind it. One survivor who worked as a nurse in the camp, Olga Lengyel, explained it after the war with disturbing clarity. To Nazi ideology, a pregnant Jewish woman did not simply represent one less useful worker. She represented the concrete possibility of a new Jewish generation, and within the racial framework of the regime, that possibility itself was a danger that had to be eliminated before it could take form. That distinction matters. It explains why treatment was not identical for every prisoner. Polish women, Sinti and Roma women, and German political prisoners were also sent to their deaths if they arrived pregnant, but only until 1943. From that year onward, automatic execution stopped for them. In time, some were even allowed to carry pregnancies to term. For Jewish women, by contrast, there was no year of change, no exception, no nuance. The sentence remained identical from the first day of the camp to the last. The objective was not merely to control who could work, it was to decide which peoples would be allowed to exist in the next generation. With that logic in place, selection on the ramp should, in theory, have been enough. Any visibly pregnant woman could be rejected there, in the first few minutes, after stepping off the train. But the system was not content to wait until pregnancy became visible. It went further. Inside the camp, among prisoners who had already survived the first selection and spent weeks or months in forced labor, pregnancies still existed. Some had begun before deportation and were only faintly visible beneath the clothing. Others resulted from sexual relationships between prisoners or from sexual violence committed by guards and capas. Those pregnancies could not always be seen during roll call. And to the camp administration, an invisible pregnancy was still an unresolved problem. That is where the mechanism that opened this video comes in. The announcement of double rations, the promise of a special section with better food and medical care. It was not an isolated incident or the invention of one particular guard. It was a procedure repeated, with variations, at different moments and in different parts of the camp, a tool designed specifically to make hidden pregnancies reveal themselves voluntarily when sight alone could not detect them. Hunger, the hope of rest, trust in the word of medical authority. Inside Auschwitz, all of these could become bait in a trap. The system did not simply wait for its victims, it called them forward. Against that machinery, the only real defense was the body itself, and hiding a pregnancy for months, under conditions of extreme hunger, forced labor, and constant surveillance was a physical feat before it was a decision. Some women benefited from something almost paradoxical. The camp uniforms themselves, the clothes issued to prisoners, were not tailored. Often they were dresses confiscated from women who had been murdered only hours earlier, loose, worn, shapeless garments intended merely to cover bodies, not fit them. Beneath that formless fabric, a growing abdomen could remain unnoticed for several weeks longer than it could have under fitted clothing. What the system had designed as another form of dehumanization, taking away even the clothes that rightfully belonged to prisoners and forcing them to wear garments that had belonged to someone else, sometimes ended up functioning as an unintended shield. But fabric alone was not enough. The lie also had to survive direct pressure. There are several documented cases of women who, when questioned face-to-face about a pregnancy that was already beginning to show, denied it without their voices trembling. 3 of those women, who did not know one another, went through almost exactly the same test at different times. Each was closely observed by an officer who suspected something. Each understood that telling the truth meant signing her own death sentence, and each, separately, chose to deny the obvious. All 3 passed the selection. All three were transferred with another group of prisoners to a slave labor camp in Freiburg, Germany, where for 12 hours a day they manufactured parts for fighter aircraft inside a former porcelain factory, surviving on little more than ersatz coffee and watery soup. There, far from the gas chambers of Birkenau but not far from hunger or exhaustion, all three reached the final stage of pregnancy at almost the same time, without knowing that the other two even existed. There is one detail worth stopping on, because it changes the meaning of this entire story. Those women were not transferred to Freiburg because anyone felt compassion for them. They were transferred because, by 1944, the German war machine desperately needed slave labor to sustain arms production, and Auschwitz could no longer supply enough workers. The same system designed to exterminate Jewish bodies with the greatest possible efficiency began, out of sheer economic necessity, keeping some of those bodies alive a little longer, not because their fate mattered, but because their labor did. That cold administrative detail, entirely detached from any humanitarian intention, was precisely what gave those three women the margin that Birkenau's totalizing machinery of extermination would never have given them. No SS decision was intended to save a mother or a child, but the Third Reich's hunger for labor, in its final phase, opened a crack that its hunger for extermination had left sealed. And inside that crack, 3 babies were born who more than 80 years later are still alive. Before the war, Gisela Perl was not a prisoner. She was a gynecologist, one of the few female physicians in her region, with her own practice in Maramaroshiget, married to a surgeon named Ephraim, and the mother of a son and a daughter. In any other context, hers would simply have been described as a successful life. On the 19th of March 1944, Nazi Germany occupied Hungary. Within weeks, Perl's family was confined to a ghetto, and shortly afterward loaded into a freight car with thousands of others. The journey to Auschwitz lasted 8 days, without enough room for everyone to sit at the same time, without sufficient water, and without anyone knowing their final destination. Her younger daughter had been hidden at the last moment, with a non-Jewish family willing to risk their own lives to protect her. Her son traveled with Perl, along with her husband. The separation upon leaving the train was immediate. Men to one side, women to the other, without time for a real goodbye. Of the 10,000 to 12,000 people who arrived in that same group of transports, only around 3,000 were selected for forced labor. The rest were sent directly to the gas chamber within hours. Perl would never see her son again. She would never see her husband alive again either. Among the female doctors who identified themselves to SS officers, one name caught someone's attention. That of an old acquaintance of the family, a Hungarian physician who years earlier had dined at Perl's home without her knowing that he was already part of the Nazi apparatus. He singled her out for a fate different from most. Neither ordinary forced labor nor the gas chamber, but a post inside the camp's medical system. Along with 4 other doctors and 4 nurses, Perl was ordered to organize a prisoner hospital in the women's section, with only a single scalpel available to all of them, which had to be sharpened against a stone whenever it became blunt. Soon afterward, a different order came, this time directly from the doctor supervising the camp, Josef Mengele. Whenever Perl detected a pregnancy among the prisoners, she was to report it immediately. The explanation she was given sounded almost reasonable within the irrationality of the place. Those women would be transferred to a special camp, with better food and suitable conditions for carrying a pregnancy to term. For a time, Perl followed the order. She did not yet have reason to doubt the explanation, and doubting without proof, in a place where suspicion alone could cost a life, was not a simple choice. The doubt came all at once, not through an explanation, but through a scene. One day, near the crematorium, Perl witnessed a group of pregnant women being attacked by dogs trained for that purpose while SS officers watched. There was no special camp waiting for them on the other side. There was no better food, no medical treatment, no different treatment from that given to any other condemned prisoner. There was only another method of killing, concealed behind an administrative promise that sounded like care. That is the turn that connects this story to the trap of double rations that opened this video. It was not an anonymous guard using a lie to expose hidden pregnancies. This time, the lie came from the mouth of the camp's chief doctor, directed at another doctor, a prisoner, yes, but still a physician, someone specifically trained to recognize whether a clinical explanation made sense. If the system could deceive even a doctor by using the language of medicine, clean beds, better diet, prenatal care, then no prisoner, however informed or distrustful, was safe from that kind of trap. The lie did not only hunt pregnancies, it hunted, specifically, the trust people place in someone who presents himself as a doctor. At that moment, Pearl made a decision that would stay with her for the rest of her life. No pregnant woman under her care would ever again be handed over to that lie. From that scene beside the crematorium onward, Pearl changed sides within the very system that forced her to work. Every day, she worked under the direct orders of the same doctor prisoners had nicknamed the Angel of Death. From that moment on, without saying it aloud to anyone, she began to operate as his exact opposite inside the same building. While Mengele decided, with the same calm another man might use to sign a form, who would die and when, Pearl used every hour outside his direct supervision to remove as many names as possible from that accounting. Where she had once reported pregnancies because she had been ordered to, she now did exactly the opposite. Whenever she discovered one, she made certain no one else knew, and she acted before the woman's body revealed what she could no longer conceal. The conditions in which she worked had nothing medical about them in the conventional sense. There was no anesthesia, there were no sterilized instruments, not even complete sets of instruments. The prisoner hospital's single scalpel had to be shared and sharpened against a stone between uses. There were no clean beds and no reliable electric light. Pearl performed abortions at night, on the dirt floor or on the bare boards of a bunk, using her hands as her primary tools, while keeping one ear on the barracks door and the other on the footsteps of night patrols. Every procedure was both a medical act and a capital offense. If a guard caught her, the sentence for both her and the woman she was helping was immediate death, without exception. Over time, Pearl reached a conclusion that she later summarized after liberation with an honesty that did not seek absolution. The real role the system had reserved for Jewish doctors inside the camp was not to heal. It was, in a twisted way, to administer death on terms slightly different from those planned by the SS to choose, when choice still existed, the less brutal version of an outcome that would happen anyway. It was not about saving lives in the traditional sense. It was about deciding, within an impossibly narrow margin of action, who would die that night and who had a real chance to see another dawn. That margin, however, had a limit even Pearl could not fully control. There were occasions when labor began before there was time to intervene, or when a woman somehow managed to give birth without anyone noticing. In those cases, the danger did not disappear. It shifted to the newborn. A baby's cry in the middle of the night, in a barracks packed with dozens of women, was not only a risk to the mother, it was a death sentence for everyone sleeping nearby, because discovery of a hidden birth could be punished with the collective execution of an entire block. After the war, Pearl described at least one episode in which she tried to keep a newborn alive by hiding it beneath blankets, delaying the inevitable as long as she could. The baby would not stop crying. Every minute that sound passed through the wooden boards of the barracks brought the mother, the child, and every woman in the block closer to the same fate. Pearl took the newborn in her arms and ended its life in silence, then hid the body among others waiting to be cremated. In her later account, she did not describe it as an act of cruelty on her part, but as the bitterest continuation of the same battle she fought every night, deciding, within a margin that should never have existed, which form of death was less cruel than another. This is the hardest point in the entire video, and it should be said plainly. The woman who had become the most consistent defender of pregnant prisoners in Auschwitz ended up, on more than one occasion, being the person who ended a newborn's life with her own hands. Not because anyone ordered her to, not out of indifference, because she knew that the alternative, allowing the crying to continue, allowing a night patrol to hear it, meant the death of the mother, the child, and dozens of other women in the same barracks. The system did not merely force people to choose between life and death. In its most extreme cases, it forced them to choose which death, among several, would happen that night, and placed that decision in the hands of the one person who, in theory, had sworn above all to protect life. There is another woman whose story runs parallel to Pearl's and answers the same question with an almost opposite decision. Before the war, Stanisława Leszczyńska worked as a midwife in Łódź, Poland. When the Nazis occupied the city and confined the Jewish population in a ghetto, she and her family began working with the resistance. False documents, smuggled food, sustained assistance for months to people who were neither relatives nor members of their own immediate community. The Gestapo eventually discovered the network. On the 17th of April 1943, Leszczyńska and her daughter Sylvia were deported to Auschwitz and tattooed with the numbers 41335 and 41336. Her husband and eldest son managed to escape that same raid and joined the armed resistance in Warsaw. She would never see them alive again. Her husband was killed fighting during the Warsaw Uprising in the summer of 1944, while she remained imprisoned hundreds of kilometers away, with no way of knowing. Upon arriving at Auschwitz, she quickly understood that her only possible advantage was her profession, and proving it depended on one tiny detail. No one was going to believe her word without physical evidence. She managed to hide the certificate identifying her as a qualified midwife inside a toothpaste tube that passed inspection. A German camp doctor then assigned her to work in the infirmary of the women's sector, in what was known, without irony on the part of those who administered it, as the maternity ward. The description of that place contradicts every image the word maternity might evoke. A wooden barracks, around 30 cots beside a brick stove that barely produced heat, several women sharing each cot. Rats the size of cats moving among the bodies. Widespread dysentery. No sterile instruments. No real medicine. It was not a place designed to receive life. Until then, it had been a transit point toward death, with one additional step. First be born, then die. Before Leszczyńska arrived, that additional step was administered by two women, both prisoners themselves, though of a different kind. Schwester Clara, a German woman originally imprisoned for killing a baby, and her assistant, Schwester Fanny. Together, they were responsible for declaring babies stillborn, even when they had been born alive, and then drowning them in a barrel of water, almost always within sight or hearing of the mother who had just given birth. When Leszczyńska was told that this was, in theory, to be part of her function within that system, she refused. She was then taken before the doctor who supervised the entire camp, in the expectation that the presence of a higher medical authority would be enough to break her resolve. She refused again, with exactly the same firmness. What followed is one of the least explainable details in this entire story and, for that reason, one of the most revealing. In Auschwitz, refusing a direct order from an SS doctor twice usually had only one possible consequence: immediate death, often carried out publicly as a warning to the rest of the camp. Leszczyńska did not die. No one, not even her own son decades later, ever managed to explain why. She was simply allowed to continue working in that ward, without formal punishment, transfer, or visible retaliation. That detail matters because, for a moment, it breaks the image of a perfectly controlled system, without cracks that dominates much of this story. Auschwitz functioned, in the overwhelming majority of cases, with lethal and predictable efficiency. But it was not a flawless machine. There were occasional openings that had nothing to do with strategy on the part of those who passed through them, but with the sheer unpredictability of a system administered, in the end, by human beings, some of whom, for reasons history itself has never fully reconstructed, chose not to apply the sentence that the logic of the place demanded. Leszczyńska used that opening until the final day of the camp. From then on, for almost 2 years, Leszczyńska attended every birth that came into that room, as if she were working in the finest maternity hospital in Europe, rather than in one of the deadliest places ever built. She sang softly to calm women during labor. She prayed with those who wanted to pray. When a mother asked, she baptized the newborn according to the Catholic rite, a gesture with no practical value for the child's survival, but enormous meaning for a woman who knew she would probably lose that baby within hours or days. Prisoners began to call her Mutti, mother. According to her later testimony, she attended around 3,000 births in that barracks. The exact number is impossible to verify. With absolute certainty, she herself later acknowledged that there were probably more, given the pace of simultaneous births described by other witnesses, but the figure appears, with minor variations, in every source documenting her story. And there is one figure within that total that no later account disputes. By her own count, every baby she delivered was born alive. Not one died during labor because of a medical failure on her part. In a place with no proper instruments, no medicine, and no minimum hygienic conditions, that outcome has no simple explanation beyond the skill and sheer determination of one woman. The real problem began after birth. After liberation, Leszczyńska reconstructed the approximate fate of those 3,000 births, and that distribution is one of the hardest parts of this story to hear. Around 1,000 babies died in the days or weeks after birth simply from cold, hunger, or disease, inside a barracks with no real heating and not enough milk to feed them. Around 1,500 were drowned directly by Schwester Clara and her assistant, the overwhelming majority of them children of Jewish mothers. A smaller group, several hundred, were selected because of physical appearance, light-colored eyes, blonde hair, features considered Aryan under the regime's racial criteria, and sent out of the camp to a Germanization center in the town of Nakwo, where they lost their original identity and were given for adoption to German families, with their mothers never learning what became of them. Of the total, only around 30 children survived inside the camp itself, in their mother's arms, until liberation. Even those 30 were not entirely outside the reach of the system. On Mengele's own recommendation, during the summer of 1943, a space was created inside Sector BIE called, again without irony on the part of those running it, the kindergarten, with a seesaw, a sandbox, and a carousel. It was not an act of tenderness toward children. In practice, it functioned as a nursery for research subjects. The children growing up there, including several Leszczynska, had helped bring into the world, remained available as material for Mengele's own medical experiments. Faced with a fate she could not control, Leszczynska found a quiet form of resistance within the narrow space available to her. Before babies selected for Germanization were taken away, she made a small hidden tattoo beneath the arm, not visible at a glance, but enough that one day, years later, someone might be able to identify them if they ever searched for their family of origin. She could not stop them from being taken. She could at least leave a mark that might make a return possible someday. Here lies the deepest irony of this entire chapter, and it is worth stating clearly because it changes how everything before it should be read. The creation of that maternity ward in 1943 was presented within the camp administration as a kind of concession, a place where, unlike under the earlier policy, pregnancy could be allowed to reach term. Viewed from the outside, that decision might even look like a gesture of humanity within the horror. It was not. What actually happened was that the same death was redistributed among more methods and more people. Before 1943, a pregnant woman died in a single act, by injection or gas, and the number of direct participants was small. After 1943, that same death was divided. Hunger handled one portion, drowning another, forced assimilation which erased an identity without having to kill the body a third. No individual official had to carry the full responsibility for exterminating an entire generation. Each administered only one fraction of the final outcome, which, added together, amounted to exactly the same extermination as before, better concealed beneath the appearance of regular medical procedure. The maternity ward did not soften the system. It made the system harder to name for what it was. Everything described so far took place within a broader framework, and it is worth naming it, even briefly, because it explains why the reproductive body of a woman, pregnant or not, was never a secondary issue for the regime that administered Auschwitz. In Block 10 of the main camp, doctors such as Karl Klauberg and Horst Schumann conducted forced sterilization experiments on female prisoners, injections directly into the uterus, exposure to radiation at doses that caused severe internal burns, all under the stated justification of finding a quick and inexpensive method to prevent entire populations from reproducing on a large scale. Some women subjected to those experiments survived with permanent physical damage. Others died directly from complications. Among the testimonies is that of a survivor identified as Aliza Baruch, exposed in 3 separate sessions to X-ray machines for 20 minutes at a time. She lost all her hair, her skin darkened, and she suffered internal bleeding. A prisoner doctor was ordered to remove one of her ovaries to complete the experiment. Deliberately, he removed only one ovary and part of the uterus, the minimum necessary to comply with the order, without completely destroying the reproductive capacity of the woman in front of him. When camp authorities discovered that quiet act of resistance, they sent the doctor to the gas chamber. Baruch survived and, years later, was able to have 2 children of her own. A recent study based on testimony from several survivors even suggests that a chemical substance may have been mixed into food distributed in the women's sector, with the aim of suppressing menstruation. A hypothesis the research community is still working to confirm, but one independently described by several women after liberation who had no opportunity to coordinate their accounts. That is the real context behind every individual story in this video. Pregnancy was not monitored by accident or because of the personal moralism of isolated guards. It was monitored because, within the regime's ideology, the reproductive capacity of a Jewish or Roma or Slavic woman was itself a battlefield. Every prevented birth, every forced sterilization, every suppressed menstrual cycle pointed toward the same declared objective: preventing the existence of a next generation. Against an objective that total, no woman acting alone had any real room to maneuver. And this is where it is worth looking once more at the cases in this video, but from a different angle. At all the people who appear under no name in any history book, but without whose choices none of these stories could have ended differently from the way the system planned. The woman who did not step forward when double rations were promised later needed someone not to betray her through months of forced labor, as her growing abdomen became increasingly difficult to hide. The 3 women transferred to Freiburg needed the prisoners around them to remain silent through 12-hour shifts, day after day, knowing what that silence would mean if discovered. Every woman who entered Pearl's barracks needed Pearl to risk her own life every night, with no guarantee of anything in return. Every woman who gave birth under Leszczynska's care needed a midwife willing to refuse twice before the most feared medical authority in the camp. That pattern, repeated again and again throughout this video, is the most important finding in this entire story, and the thread connecting every chapter to the next. No woman survived a pregnancy in Auschwitz completely alone, in a place designed to destroy every form of solidarity among prisoners through hunger, constant surveillance, and collective punishments that turned the woman in the next bunk into a potential danger. The survival of a pregnancy depended, without exception, on at least one other person choosing, at a specific moment, to risk her own life for someone else. A doctor, a midwife, a barracks companion who looked away at exactly the right moment. The system gambled that fear would destroy the possibility of that kind of choice. In every one of these cases, it lost that bet. There is one more piece of context that helps explain why so many of the documented stories in this video. Pearl's story. Most of the specific cases occur specifically in 1944 and not earlier. Between May and July of that year, Nazi Germany deported more than 400,000 Hungarian Jews to Auschwitz in just 8 weeks, the fastest and most concentrated deportation operation of the entire Holocaust. Entire trains arrived several times a day, each carrying thousands of people, at a pace that exceeded even the capacity of gas chambers and crematoria built specifically to process death on a massive scale. The camp, already functioning as an industrial extermination machine, became overwhelmed by its own speed. That saturation produced a consequence the Germans had not planned. Individual supervision, case by case, became physically impossible to maintain. There were not enough SS officers to personally monitor every birth, every suspicion of pregnancy, every women's block. The system's solution was delegation, assigning prisoners with medical training, like Pearl, or midwifery experience, like Leszczynska, to administer that part of the machinery directly, under the promise or threat that they would answer with their own lives for any irregularity. The idea was that these women would function as another extension of Nazi control, policing their fellow prisoners in the same way that an officer no longer had enough capacity to do personally. That calculation failed the system, and that failure is the reason this video exists. By delegating direct control over pregnancies to prisoners, the Nazi machinery assumed that fear of death would be enough to turn those women into obedient executors of its orders. In most cases, the calculation was correct, but in every case documented in this video, it was wrong. The administrative saturation of 1944, intended to accelerate extermination, ended up creating exactly the kind of unsupervised space Pearl needed to work at night and that Leszczynska needed to sustain for almost 2 years. A refusal that, under stricter supervision, would probably have cost her life within hours. The system's efficiency, pushed to its absolute limit, ended up manufacturing its own cracks. So let us return to the line of women standing before the officer who promised double rations, to the 200 hands that went up, to the trucks that did not go to the kitchen. There is no record of any of those 200 women surviving that afternoon. The promise performed exactly the function for which it had been designed, turning the hope of eating a little better into the final voluntary act of their lives. Nothing more needs to be described. The outcome has already been stated and requires no embellishment. The young woman who did not step forward does have a name, and her story did not end that day. Her name was Miriam Rosenthal. She was just as hungry as the other 200 women, her body just as weakened, her desire to believe that, for once, a camp authority might be telling the truth just as strong. The difference was not privileged information or some rational calculation the others were incapable of making. According to her own later account, it was an instinctive distrust of how easily that man offered something good in a place that never gave anything without demanding a life in return. That distrust bought her time, not safety. Miriam spent the following months like every other prisoner. Dawn roll calls, forced labor, minimal rations, and a growing abdomen beneath the loose fabric of her uniform while she did everything possible to move, stand, and breathe exactly like the women around her who were not pregnant. Any visible change in her routine could have been the signal a guard trained to detect precisely that was waiting for. Toward the end of the war, as the front drew closer, and the Third Reich began moving prisoners toward labor camps inside Germany, Miriam was transferred to a subcamp near Dachau. There, far from Birkenau's gas chambers but still inside the same machinery of exploitation, she gave birth to a son. She survived. Her son survived. According to the system's original design, neither of them should have been alive. Miriam and 6 other pregnant women from the same group had been separated from the rest of the prisoners sent to their deaths that day in the line. All 7 babies in that group were born, against any reasonable odds. During the final months of a war the regime already knew it was losing. There is a second thread we promised to close. The 3 women transferred to Freiberg, who reached the end of pregnancy at almost exactly the same time without knowing that the other 2 existed. Their names were Priska, Rachel, and Anka. None of the 3 had known the others before the camp. Each hid her pregnancy separately, lied separately when questioned, and survived months of 12-hour workdays manufacturing aircraft parts while an increasingly weakened body sustained, against all medical logic, a pregnancy reaching full term. In April 1945, as the Allies drew closer and the Freiberg factory was about to be evacuated, Priska gave birth on a table inside the very industrial plant where she had worked, weighing just over 30 kilograms at the time. Days later, together with Rachel, Anka, and the remaining prisoners, she was loaded onto a train bound for Mauthausen, a 17-day journey under extreme conditions with almost no water or food. Somewhere along that route, inside an open coal wagon, Rachel gave birth to her son. Anka gave birth to her daughter during the final stage of the journey, on a cart, literally in front of the gates of Mauthausen. All 3 should have died there immediately, along with their newborn children, in a camp that still had an operating gas chamber. What saved them in the following hours was not a decision made in their favor. The supply of Zyklon B had run out, and with Allied troops only days away, SS officers began abandoning their posts. The camp was liberated shortly afterward. All 3 mothers survived. All 3 babies, Hannah, Mark, and Eva, survived as well. For decades, none of the 3 children knew the other 2 existed. Their mothers had never truly known one another inside the camp, and each family grew up assuming theirs was the only story of its kind. They finally met as adults many years later through chance contact with veterans of the Allied division that had liberated Mauthausen. Today, all 3 are over 80 years old and still share the same question that runs through this video. What does it mean that 3 women, strangers to one another, made exactly the same impossible decision, in the same month, under the same kind of circumstances, and that all 3 were right? Miriam on one side, Priska, Rachel, and Anka on the other. None of them knew one another. None knew Perl or Leszczynska. No coordination among them was possible. And yet, by separate paths, all arrived at the same response to the same impossible question. Trust, no promise made by the system. Keep the body hidden for as long as necessary, and entrust one's life to the possibility that somewhere along the way, someone else would choose not to betray them. In practice, that was the only survival strategy Auschwitz never managed to eliminate completely. So what did surviving a pregnancy inside Auschwitz really require? It did not require, as one might imagine from the outside, a single dramatic act of heroism. First, it required systematic distrust of every gesture from the system that resembled kindness. A promise of better food, a transfer to a supposed special section, even a maternity ward bearing the name of a safe place. Every form of apparent care, examined closely, proved to be another mechanism for producing exactly the same outcome the camp had been built to produce. It also required sustaining that distrust for months, while the body grew weaker and harder to hide. And at some point in the process, it required total dependence on someone else's decision. A barracks companion choosing not to report what she saw. A doctor risking her own life night after night. A midwife refusing twice before the authority feared by the entire camp. Gisela Perl and Stanisława Leszczynska never met. They worked in different parts of the same system, faced the same absolute restriction: no mother's life or child's life could be openly saved, and arrived at responses that, placed side by side, seemed to contradict one another. One terminated pregnancies so that the system would not decide when and how a life ended. The other absolutely refused to end a single life, even knowing that most of those lives would end anyway at the hands of others inside the camp. They were not opposing philosophies. They were two different responses to the same question for which no good answer existed, made by two women who each decided, in her own way, not to surrender the entire decision to the system surrounding them. Neither emerged untouched. When Pearl was liberated at Bergen-Belsen in April 1945, she learned that her husband had been beaten to death shortly before the end of the war, and that her son had been sent directly to the gas chamber on the same day the family arrived at Auschwitz. She attempted to take her own life. She survived that attempt because of the care of a young Catholic priest who stayed with her during the following days, and later, in the United States, through the personal intervention of Eleanor Roosevelt, who helped her obtain residency and encouraged her to practice medicine again. Pearl spent the next 43 years working as a gynecologist in New York, specializing in the treatment of infertility, and personally assisted in nearly 3,000 births, almost exactly the same number of pregnancies she had been forced to terminate in Auschwitz. Before entering every delivery room, she repeated the same sentence quietly to herself: that after everything that had happened, life owed her one more birth. In 1979, she moved to Israel, joining the daughter who had survived in hiding, fulfilling a promise she had made with her husband and father on the day they stepped off the train together, that one day they would meet again in Jerusalem. Leszczynska, for her part, survived the war and returned to Poland, where she resumed her work as a midwife until the end of her life. The main avenue that today leads to the entrance of the Auschwitz Memorial bears her name. After her death, she received the Auschwitz Cross in recognition of what she had done inside that barracks. Decades later, the Catholic Church opened a process to examine her possible beatification, a process that remains ongoing, turning a midwife from an extermination camp into a candidate for a form of recognition usually associated with martyrs and saints. None of this is told to create shock value or to turn the suffering of these women into spectacle. It is told because it documents, with a level of detail few other stories allow, what one human being is willing to risk for another when the system surrounding them has removed every advantage, every rational incentive, and every guarantee of success. That is precisely why these stories are still studied 80 years later, not as macabre curiosities, but as documented evidence of where, under the worst imaginable conditions, the true limit of human solidarity lies. At the beginning of this video, 200 women raised their hands at the promise of a little more food. None of them knew that the promise was, in reality, the most dangerous question Auschwitz could ask a pregnant woman. The women who survived that question did not do so because they had more information, or because they were simply luckier in the ordinary sense of the word. They survived because, somewhere in that story, someone else decided that the life of a stranger was worth risking her own. That decision, repeated silently thousands of times inside a place designed to make it impossible, was the one thing Auschwitz never managed to exterminate completely.